This section is going to start to look at the lower digestive tract, concentrating just on the stomach, and we'll continue on with the intestines in a later section. When talking about the upper and lower digestive tracts, the stomach is actually a little bit confusing. In classical definitions of upper and lower digestive tract, which is actually based on embryological development, the stomach ends up as part of the upper digestive tract. Looking at it anatomically in the mature system, the stomach is obviously part of the lower digestive tract because it's in the abdominal cavity with the intestines, and it has the simple columnar epithelium that we see in the intestines also. And it's covered with the serosa, the peritoneum, that does not cover any of the upper digestive tract organs. However, from a clinical perspective, the stomach can be considered part of the upper GI in the sense that an upper GI endoscopy can look at the stomach as it's a camera passed through the esophagus, and it can look in the stomach, and in fact can even look at the very beginning of the small intestine. From a mature anatomical point of view, the stomach is lower GI. From a clinical point of view, it can be considered upper GI, which is in keeping with the classical embryological approach. In this course, we don't really look at the embryology, the development, so much. So we're going to ignore that classical view and stick to the anatomical with the clinical perspective in mind also. Anatomically, the stomach has several different regions. Where the esophagus attaches to it is called the cardia, referring to the heart, which is nearby on the other side of the diaphragm. Then next to that is a region called the fundus, which is the part of the stomach that bulges up above where the esophagus attaches. The term fundus is actually a common word to describe any bulge above or beyond the normal limits of a structure, such as where the cornea bulges out at the front of the eyeball, which is beyond the sort of spherical shape of the eyeball. That's the fundus of the eye. So fundus is just talking about that bulging part up above. It's sort of the first area of the stomach where food gets to, especially when the stomach's completely full up to that point. Then the majority of the stomach is called the body, which basically extends down from the level of the cardia and fundus until it reaches an area called the pylorus. The pylorus has two segments. There's the pyloric antrum and the pyloric canal. Antrum basically means from the Latin waiting room. So it's the place leading into the pyloric canal, and the pyloric canal is just a narrowing of the stomach going towards the pyloric valve. The inside surface of the stomach is covered in folds called rugae, R-U-G-A-E. The singular of that word is ruga. And the rugae in the pyloric canal are all oriented to encourage the movement of the fluid inside the stomach towards the pyloric valve. Elsewhere, the rugae are kind of in all sorts of different directions. The point of the rugae is, as the stomach expands, the rugae flatten out. It allows for the mucosal layer to stretch without actually stretching the cells of that epithelium. We see that in other places too. There are rugae in the urinary bladder, for instance, so that it can expand as it fills with urine. There are also 3 layers of muscular tissue in the muscularis externa of the stomach. Circular and longitudinal fibers like other organs, but then there's an oblique layer going at another angle, 45 degrees from the other two. And that extra layer allows for more contractile activity, which is important for churning within the stomach. Churning is a special type of propulsion, if you will, for the stomach. In what are essentially peristaltic waves, the circular fibers, longitudinal fibers, and oblique fibers squeeze all of the contents of the stomach towards the pylorus, but only a little bit of the contents of the stomach come out of the pylorus into the duodenum. The majority of the contents sort of wash back towards the body of the stomach. The contents of the stomach are liquefied. The pasty food that you've swallowed, when it gets to the stomach, through this churning ends up getting mixed in with a very watery substance called chyme, and the constant churning back and forth makes sure that it gets nice and liquefied. And then a little bit at a time is sent on into the small intestine. All of the contents of the stomach will eventually fit into the small intestine. It's just the small intestine can't stretch out for all of it to be introduced at once. So this churning, while it liquefies a food, also slowly introduces the contents of the stomach into the small intestine. You eat a really big meal and you go to bed that night and you're just stuffed and you're like, oh, I'm never gonna eat that much again. A lot of it's because the contents are staying in the stomach and churning for storage until there's enough time to slowly introduce all of that into the thin tube of the small intestine. This image demonstrates the structure in the wall of the stomach. Importantly, in the mucosal layer, the epithelium is arranged into invaginations, which are gastric glands. The opening of those glands, called the gastric pits, on the inside surface of the stomach look like a bunch of little pits in the inner surface of the stomach. Deep in the gastric gland, there are a few different types of cells that contribute to what happens in the stomach. The parietal cells are responsible for making stomach acid. Chief cells are responsible for making the digestive enzymes, which is primarily pepsin, an enzyme that breaks down proteins. And then the enteroendocrine cell, as it's labeled here, is also known as a G cell, which releases gastrin, a hormone which will actually tell the other cells of the gastric gland to be more active. Notice how the representation of vesicles in the chief cell are on the apical side, secreting into the lumen of the gland, while the vesicles in the G cells are on the basal side, secreting into the lamina propria of the mucosa. Also, not represented here, in the neck of the gastric pit are neck cells which secrete the basic mucus, a watery substance which is the basis of what we call chyme in the stomach. In the neck cells are buffering agents which help to protect the inside lining of the stomach against the acid being made by the parietal cell. And one of the main components of that buffering system is prostaglandin. The reason why aspirin can cause stomach ulcers is because aspirin acts against the enzyme that makes prostaglandins and therefore cuts down on the buffering, allowing your stomach acid to eat through the lining of your stomach more than normal. This is an image that I took off the internet. It's a very simplistic representation of the parietal cell, but it shows what's involved in making stomach acid at the level that I'm interested in you knowing in this course. Now, in the parietal cell, the carbonic acid reactions are taking place. So carbon dioxide and water are combined by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase to be carbonic acid, which then dissociates into hydrogen ions, or protons, and bicarbonate ions. The protons are pumped out of the cell into the lumen of the stomach by the proton pump, or a hydrogen potassium ATPase, very similar to sodium potassium pumps that we learned about for excitable membranes in A&P1. The potassium comes in through the pump because it's necessary for the two to be pumped in opposite directions, but then the potassium just leaks right back out. It's not necessary for the cell, just necessary for the pump to work. And then bicarbonate leaves the cell to aid in buffering blood plasma, and when it leaves the cell, chloride comes into the cell, like we see in the red blood cells from the respiratory system. And the chloride then just goes through the cell and reaches the lumen of the stomach. And so with the protons that are pumped out and the chloride that ends up coming in with the bicarbonate getting out, stomach acid is HCl, or hydrochloric acid. The two ions leave the cell independently, but in solution that would be called hydrochloric acid. Regulation of gastric activity happens at three different levels. There's the cephalic phase, referring to what happens in the head, the gastric phase, which is how the stomach regulates itself, and the intestinal phase, which is how the intestine feeds back to tell the stomach what to do. The cephalic phase is largely excitatory for gastric activity. The sight, smell, taste, or even thought of food will increase activity coming from the vagus nerve to secrete more from the gastric glands and for gastric musculature to be more active. Essentially, it's your anticipation of food leading to the stomach being more active, ready to digest that. Now, there is a inhibitory aspect that can come from the cephalic phase. Just some of the higher processes, mood and those sorts of things, can cause a lack of parasympathetic activity. The gastric phase is how the stomach regulates itself, and this is largely a feed-forward kind of mechanism. This is largely a positive feedback sort of mechanism. So when the stomach is full of food, the stomach wall will distend, or the chemical composition of what's in the cell will increase quite a bit. This will increase activity of the musculature to move and churn the food around, as well as secretions from the gastric glands to produce more of the juices necessary to digest that food. Now, there is a very important negative feedback cycle built into this, which is when the pH in the stomach gets too low, less than a pH of 2, that will decrease the secretions from the gastric glands and decrease the amount of muscular activity. Just when the stomach gets too active, the acidity of the stomach can get pretty severe and potentially damage the stomach, so it slows itself down. There's also, in this figure, included emotional distress as a negative feedback signal. I don't think it's quite appropriate to put it in the gastric phase. It would be more of an autonomic input and should probably be up with the cephalic phase, except that it's not coming from the head. If it's sympathetic, it's coming from the thoracic and upper lumbar spinal cord. But you could trace that back eventually to higher centers causing emotional changes like depression, or from the hypothalamus if it's tied into other emotional reactions. So I wouldn't really put that in the gastric phase. I think what they're saying is that it overrides what's happening within the terminal ganglia in the wall of the stomach, but it's really probably coming from somewhere outside the stomach. The intestinal phase of gastric regulation is a negative feedback signal from the intestines, regulating how much food is being passed from the stomach into the intestines. Now, the intestines can't take all of the food very quickly, so it has to slow the stomach down, especially when the stomach is really actively digesting food. When the wall of the intestine is stretched out, or when the food coming from the stomach is especially low in pH or high in macromolecule content, called hypertonic chyme, that will release hormones, secretin, gastric inhibitory peptide, cholecystokinin, VIP, to slow down the stomach. It can also do that through local reflexes within the nervous tissue of the GI tract. Consider this question. When you feel that you've reached an answer, hit the next button to go into the next slide, which will reveal the correct answer. Enzymes, particularly pepsin, are made by the chief cell in the gastric gland. Neck cells make the mucus components, especially the buffering agents. Parietal cells make the stomach acid, and G cells make gastrin. But chief cells make the enzymes that are released.